Jake Morrison sat in the waiting room outside the Galactic Council chambers and felt his stomach twist into knots. The message had come 3 days ago through official channels, marked with the highest priority seals. Another crisis, another mess for humanity to clean up. He looked down at his hands and noticed they were shaking slightly. After 15 years as Earth's chief ambassador to the Council, he still got nervous before these meetings. Lisa Parker stood by the massive windows that looked out over Nexus Prime's gleaming towers. She wore her military uniform with perfect precision, every medal and ribbon in its proper place. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman who had seen too much war, too much death. She turned to Jake with tired eyes. "Any idea what fresh hell they want us to dive into this time?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of a dozen previous missions. Jake shrugged and pulled up the preliminary briefing on his tablet. The data made him frown. 2 species at war, civilian casualties mounting, trade routes disrupted, the same old story with different names and faces. The Zephyrians and the Krell had been fighting for 800 years, but something had changed recently. The conflict had exploded beyond all previous boundaries. The chamber doors opened with a soft hiss, and Keeper Thex emerged. The Vorthon stood nearly 9 feet tall, his blue-gray feathers ruffled with what Jake had learned to recognize as irritation. His 4 eyes focused on the human delegation with the kind of look reserved for particularly slow children. "Ambassador Morrison, Commander Parker, the Council will see you now," Thex said in his mechanical translator voice. They followed him into the vast, circular chamber where representatives from 47 different species sat in tiered rows. Jake had been here many times before, but the sight still impressed him. Beings from across the galaxy, working together to maintain peace and order. At least, that was the theory. The holographic display in the center showed a 3-dimensional map of the Outer Rim territories. Red zones marked areas of active conflict, and Jake counted at least 20 separate battle sites. Yellow indicators showed refugee movements, streams of displaced populations fleeing the violence. The numbers in the corner made his breath catch. Over 2 billion people had already been forced from their homes. Keeper Thex activated his personal projection system and began the briefing. Images of destroyed cities flashed across the display, followed by reports of chemical weapons usage and orbital bombardments. The Zephyrians and Krell had abandoned all pretense of civilized warfare. "The situation has deteriorated beyond acceptable parameters," Thex said, his translated voice carrying no emotion. "Economic disruption to Council trade routes has reached critical levels. Shipping delays are costing member worlds billions of credits daily." Jake noticed that Thex mentioned trade routes before casualties. He exchanged a glance with Lisa, who had obviously caught the same thing. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What about the civilian populations?" Jake asked. "The refugee crisis alone seems to require immediate humanitarian intervention." Yes, of course," Thex waved a dismissive feather. "But the primary concern remains the economic stability of the Council territories. We cannot allow these primitive conflicts to disrupt galactic commerce." The display shifted to show strategic projections. Both the Zephyrian fleet and Krell armadas were massing for what appeared to be final engagements. Intelligence reports suggested both sides possessed planet-killer weapons and were preparing to use them. "Your species has proven adequate at resolving such matters in the past," continued another council member, a crystalline being whose name Jake could never pronounce correctly. "Human mediators have successfully concluded 43 major conflicts over the past 3 centuries. Lisa stepped forward. "With respect, Counselor, those previous conflicts involved species that actually wanted peace. The preliminary reports suggest both the Zephyrians and Krell are committed to total victory, not negotiated settlement." Thex's feathers ruffled again. "That is precisely why we require human intervention. Your species has a reputation for finding solutions where others see only problems. You will depart for the conflict zone immediately." Jake felt the familiar weight of expectation settling on his shoulders. Humanity had become the galaxy's troubleshooters, the ones called in when diplomacy failed and war threatened to consume entire sectors. They were good at it. Perhaps too good. Every success led to another assignment, another impossible situation to resolve. "What resources will the Council provide?" Lisa asked. "If we're going into a hot war zone with planet killers involved, we'll need significant military support." "The Council will provide standard diplomatic immunity and safe passage guarantees," Thex replied. "Beyond that, you will rely on your own fleet assets." Jake's tablet chimed with incoming data. The mission parameters were already being downloaded to their ship's computers. He scanned the summary and felt his heart sink. No backup? No Council oversight, no guarantee of extraction if things went wrong. Just another mess dropped in humanity's lap with the expectation that they would somehow fix it. The briefing continued for another hour, covering intelligence reports, tactical assessments, and political backgrounds. The more Jake learned, the more convinced he became that this mission was different. The hatred between the Zephyrians and Krell ran deeper than anyone had realized, and both sides seemed determined to fight until one or both races were extinct. As they prepared to leave, Thex approached them privately. "I trust you understand the importance of success in this matter," he said quietly. "The Council's patience with these disruptions is wearing thin. We expect swift resolution." Jake nodded, but inside he was beginning to wonder if the Council understood what they were really asking for. Some conflicts couldn't be resolved, only contained, and some prices were too high for anyone to pay, even humanity. Captain Ryan Brooks stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance and watched the tactical display with growing concern. 3 weeks had passed since the human fleet arrived in the disputed system, and the situation had only gotten worse. The planet, Keth 7, hung below them like a wounded animal, its surface scarred by orbital bombardments and chemical weapons. Dr. Amy Sullivan wiped sweat from her forehead as she worked in the makeshift medical station. The refugee camp stretched for miles in every direction, a sea of temporary shelters housing the displaced and wounded. Her medical team had been working around the clock, but the casualties kept coming faster than they could treat them. "Doctor, we have another transport incoming," called Nurse Pete Garcia from the landing pad. "Looks like survivors from the Helian colony attack." Amy nodded grimly and prepared for another wave of patients. The Helian colony had been hit 2 days ago with something the refugees called burning rain, chemical weapons that dissolved organic tissue on contact. She had seen the effects firsthand and barely slept since. Back on the Defiance, Lieutenant Ben Carter monitored communications between the warring fleets. Both sides were moving massive ship formations into position, and the energy signatures suggested they were charging weapon systems that shouldn't exist according to galactic law. "Captain, I'm reading antimatter cascade generators on 12 Zephyrian dreadnoughts," Ben reported, his voice tight with worry. "Those things could crack a moon in half." Ryan nodded and opened a channel to Ambassador Morrison. Jake's voice came through tired and frustrated from the diplomatic station on Keth 7's largest moon. "Any progress with the peace talks?" Ryan asked, though he could guess the answer from Jake's tone. "They're not talks anymore, they're just organized shouting matches," Jake replied. "Both sides have given up any pretense of wanting peace. The Zephyrian High Command demands total Krell surrender and the dismantling of their entire civilization. The Krell War Council wants every Zephyrian world turned into radioactive glass." Lisa Parker joined the conversation from her position with the human Marine contingent. "It gets worse, Captain. Both sides are openly discussing the use of planet killers. They're talking about genocide like it's a tactical option." On the surface, Dr. Sullivan examined a young Krell child who had been exposed to Zephyrian nerve agents. The antidotes in her medical kit were barely keeping the boy alive, and she knew dozens more cases were coming in every hour. She activated her comm unit to report to the fleet. "The weapons they're using down here violate every treaty in the Galactic Codex," she said, her voice shaking with anger. These aren't military targets, they're refugee camps and civilian shelters. Both sides are deliberately targeting non-combatants. Jake sat across from the Zephyrian delegation leader, Commander Vex Korath, whose scaled face showed nothing but contempt. The Zephyrian's yellow eyes glowed with hatred as he spoke through his translator. "Your human sentimentality blinds you to reality," Korath hissed. "The Krell are a plague upon this galaxy. They cannot be reasoned with, only eliminated. Every day we delay gives them time to spawn more warriors." An hour later, Jake met with General Thak Bruthorn of the Krell War Council. The massive reptilian being's scarred hide told stories of centuries of warfare, and his attitude was no different from the Zephyrians. "The scale faces speak of elimination," Bruthorn rumbled. "Good. We understand such language. When we finish with their homeworld, nothing will remain but molten rock and the screams of their ancestors." Jake tried every diplomatic approach he had learned in 15 years of service. Compromise frameworks, graduated ceasefires, neutral zone proposals, prisoner exchanges. Both sides rejected everything with increasing hostility. Perhaps a cooling-off period, Jake suggested during one session. "Both fleets could withdraw to minimum safe distance while we explore options for weakness," Korath spat. "Humans lack the spine for true warfare. You negotiate when you should conquer." Bruthorn nodded in agreement, the first time Jake had seen the two enemies agree on anything. "The ambassador speaks of safety when honor demands blood. Perhaps it is time for stronger species to guide galactic affairs." Back on the Defiance, Ben Carter's sensors detected massive energy buildups in both fleets. "Captain, they're powering up the planet killers. Both sides are preparing for simultaneous strikes." Ryan opened channels to both fleet commanders, trying to convince them to stand down. The responses were immediate and chilling. "The time for talk has ended," came the Zephyrian reply. "Witness the price of defying the righteous." "Let the galaxy see what happens to those who threaten the Krell," responded the enemy commander. Dr. Sullivan received an emergency message from the orbital medical station. A massive civilian transport carrying Krell refugees was requesting emergency docking. The ship held over 200,000 non-combatants, mostly families fleeing the violence. "Permission granted," Amy replied immediately. "Medical teams are standing by." The transport never made it to the station. Ryan watched in horror as Zephyrian fighters swarmed the defenseless vessel. Antimatter torpedoes tore through its hull, and in seconds over 200,000 lives vanished in a brief flash of light. The Krell response was immediate and devastating. Their planet-killer weapons struck Zephyria Prime's moon, cracking the satellite in half. The gravitational disruption would kill millions more as tidal waves swept across the planet's surface. Lisa's voice came across the comm from the surface, cold with rage. "They're not even trying to hide it anymore. Both sides just committed genocide while we watched." Dr. Sullivan stood in her empty medical bay, staring at the beds that should have been filled with survivors from the transport. Instead, there was nothing but empty space and the bitter taste of failure. Jake's final diplomatic session lasted exactly 17 minutes. When he suggested a neutral zone enforcement mechanism, both sides actually laughed at him. "You're soft. Human hearts make you unfit for real warfare," Korath sneered. "Perhaps weaker species should step aside when the strong settle their differences," Bruthorn added. That evening, Jake sent a coded message to Earth Command that he never thought he would write. Lisa received similar authorization from Admiral Cole herself. Ryan got his orders directly from the Secretary of Defense. The message was simple and unprecedented in human diplomatic history. Mission parameters fundamentally flawed. Recommend immediate withdrawal. Let them have their war. For the first time in 3 centuries, humanity was preparing to walk away from a conflict instead of trying to fix it. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when they pushed Earth's children too far. The antimatter explosion lit up space like a dying star, and Captain Ryan Brooks felt something break inside his chest as he watched the civilian transport disappear. 200,000 Krell refugees, mostly children and their families, had been vaporized in an instant by Zephyrian fighters. The silence on the bridge of the UES Defiance stretched for long seconds as the crew processed what they had just witnessed. "Sir," Lieutenant Ben Carter said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "sensors confirm total destruction of the refugee vessel. No survivors detected." Ryan closed his eyes and tried to push down the rage building in his stomach. In 30 years of military service, he had seen war in all its brutal forms. But this was different. This was deliberate murder of non-combatants while human ships watched helplessly from the sidelines. Dr. Amy Sullivan stood in the medical bay that she had prepared for incoming casualties from the transport. The empty beds mocked her efforts, their clean white sheets waiting for patients who would never come. Her hands shook as she began shutting down the equipment she had readied. "Doctor," Nurse Pete Garcia approached carefully, "the Krell are demanding we turn over all wounded Zephyrian prisoners for interrogation." Amy looked at him with dead eyes. "Tell them that medical facilities remain neutral under galactic law. Then tell them I don't care what they think about it." The Krell response to the transport massacre was swift and terrible. General Thak Bruthorn ordered the deployment of their most powerful weapon, a gravitational disruptor that could destabilize planetary bodies. Zephyria Prime's moon became the target, and Ryan watched the tactical display in horror as the massive satellite began to crack apart. "Gravitational cascade detected," Ben reported, his training keeping his voice steady even as his face went pale. "The moon's destruction will cause massive tidal disruptions on the planet's surface. Estimated casualties in the hundreds of millions." The chunks of shattered moon began falling towards Zephyria Prime like meteors, each impact releasing the energy of nuclear weapons. The planet's oceans rose and fell in waves that swept away entire continents. Ryan realized he was watching the systematic destruction of two entire civilizations. Ambassador Jake Morrison sat in his office on the diplomatic station and stared at the reports coming in from both sides. The Zephyrians were already planning their next escalation, something they called stellar disruption protocols. The Krell had moved their entire battle fleet into position around Zephyrian space, preparing for what their commanders called the final cleansing. His tablet chimed with an incoming message from Earth Command. Admiral Patricia Cole's face appeared on the screen, her expression grim. "Ambassador, I've been reviewing your situation reports. Are you telling me that both sides have rejected every peace proposal and are now actively committing genocide while demanding human support for their actions?" Jake nodded wearily. "Admiral, they're not even pretending to want peace anymore. Both species have decided that total extermination of their enemy is the only acceptable outcome. They mock our diplomatic efforts and suggest that humanity is too weak to understand real warfare." Lisa Parker joined the conversation from her position with the Marine contingent on the surface. Her uniform was stained with ash from the burning cities below, and her face showed the strain of 3 weeks in hell. "Ma'am, they're using weapons that violate every treaty in the Galactic Codex. Chemical agents, biological warfare, orbital bombardment of civilian targets. When we object, they tell us that humans don't have the stomach for necessary measures." Admiral Cole was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming on her desk back on Earth. "How many other species are being drawn into this conflict?" 17, so far, Jake replied. "The Andorian Federation declared for the Krell yesterday. 3 Outer Rim coalitions have sided with the Zephyrians. This is spreading like a plague across the entire sector." Dr. Sullivan's voice joined the conversation. From the medical station, "Admiral, I've got refugee camps with over 3 million displaced persons, and both sides are targeting them deliberately. My medical teams are treating chemical weapon casualties in children as young as 5 years old. When I try to set up Neutral medical zones, both armies use them as bait for ambushes. The Admiral's expression hardened. And what does the Galactic Council say about this situation? Jake almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. Keeper Thex sent a message this morning complaining about delays in shipping schedules. The Council is more concerned about trade route disruptions than the fact that we're watching the genocide of 2 entire species. The final diplomatic session was held in what had once been a school on Keth 7's surface. The building's walls were scorched from chemical weapons, and the air recyclers couldn't quite filter out the smell of death. Jake sat across from both delegation leaders, making one last attempt at reason. We could establish protected zones for civilians, he suggested. Both sides could agree to spare non-combatants while you settle your military differences. Commander Vex Korath's scales rippled with amusement. Civilians breed more soldiers, Ambassador. Military efficiency demands their elimination. General? Thak Bruthorn nodded his massive head in agreement. For once, the scale face speaks wisdom. War is not a game with rules. It is the strong consuming the weak. Jake felt something snap inside his mind as he looked at these two beings who spoke of mass murder like they were discussing shipping schedules. You're talking about billions of lives. Children, families, entire worlds full of people who just want to live in peace. Peace is the luxury of victors, Korath replied. Perhaps when stronger species have settled this matter, humans can return to their soft philosophies. Your species lacks the will for true warfare, Bruthorn added. You mediate when you should conquer. You negotiate when you should eliminate. Perhaps the galaxy needs leadership with more spine. Jake stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the damaged floor. For 17 years, he had believed in the power of diplomacy, in the idea that reasonable beings could find peaceful solutions to their differences. He looked at these two creatures and realized that some conflicts couldn't be resolved because one or both sides didn't want resolution. You're right, he said quietly. Humanity doesn't have the stomach for genocide. We don't have the will to murder civilians. We don't have the spine to watch billions die and call it victory. Both alien commanders smiled at what they took for admission of weakness. Jake activated his communicator and sent a coded message to the human fleet. The authorization codes came back within minutes from Admiral Cole herself, along with similar orders to every human ship, station, and facility in the sector. Mission status changed to immediate withdrawal, he announced to his staff. All human personnel are to evacuate the conflict zone within 72 hours. Lisa looked up from her tactical display in surprise. Sir, are you saying we're abandoning the mission? Jake nodded, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. Commander, I'm saying we're done cleaning up messes for people who think our compassion makes us weak. Let them have their war. Let them have their genocide. Let them discover what the galaxy looks like without humans around to fix their problems. The order went out across all human frequencies, and for the first time in 3 centuries, Earth's children began to walk away from a conflict instead of trying to solve it. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when they pushed humanity too far. Dr. Amy Sullivan walked through the refugee camp one last time, her medical bag heavy with supplies she couldn't leave behind. The evacuation order had come down 18 hours ago, and already the human medical teams were packing equipment with military precision. Around her, alien refugees watched with growing panic as their only source of advanced medical care prepared to vanish. Doctor, please. A Krell mother clutched at Amy's sleeve, her child burning with fever from chemical weapon exposure. My daughter needs the human medicine. Without it, she will die. Amy knelt beside the child and injected the last dose of antitoxin from her personal supply. I'm sorry, she said softly. I wish we could do more. The woman's eyes filled with tears as she realized what was happening. You are leaving us to die. Amy stood and shouldered her bag, her own eyes wet. We tried to stop this war. Both sides told us humans were too weak to understand real warfare. Perhaps they were right. Across the camp, Nurse Pete Garcia supervised the loading of medical equipment onto human transports. Every piece of advanced healing technology, every research breakthrough, every medical supply that bore human design was being packed and removed. The alien medical staff watched helplessly as equipment they didn't know how to operate or maintain disappeared into cargo containers. Captain Ryan Brooks stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance and coordinated the largest human withdrawal in galactic history. 47 ships, from massive medical vessels to small diplomatic craft, were pulling back from the conflict zone in carefully planned stages. Logistics reports all medical facilities have been evacuated, Lieutenant Ben Carter announced from his station. Dr. Sullivan's teams removed every piece of human medical technology from the refugee camps. Ryan nodded grimly. The decision had been made at the highest levels of Earth Command. If the warring species wanted to reject human help and mock human compassion, they could face the consequences of that choice. Ambassador Jake Morrison held his final meeting with Keeper Thex in the Galactic Council's emergency session chamber. The Vorthan's feathers were ruffled with indignation as he faced the human delegation. "You cannot simply abandon your responsibilities," Thex said, his mechanical translator making his voice sound even more irritated. "The Council has not authorized this withdrawal." Jake sat calmly in his chair, his hands folded on the table. "Keeper Thex, with respect, the Council didn't ask for our authorization when you sent us into this situation. We're exercising humanity's sovereign right to remove our people from a hostile environment. The economic disruption alone will cost billions of credits," another council member interjected. "Human-managed trade routes carry 60% of galactic commerce." Lisa Parker spoke from her position beside Jake. "Perhaps the council should have considered that before sending us to mediate between two species committed to mutual genocide." Thex's four eyes focused on the humans with what they had learned to recognize as barely controlled anger. "The Zephyrian and Krell situation requires immediate resolution. Human diplomatic expertise is essential to prevent sector-wide war." "The Zephyrians and Krell have made their position clear," Jake replied evenly. "They don't want our diplomatic expertise. They want total victory and complete extermination of their enemies. They've told us repeatedly that humans are too weak to understand real warfare." The council chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. For 3 centuries, humanity had been the galaxy's go-to mediators, the species called in when all other options failed. They had resolved 43 major conflicts and countless smaller disputes. Now, for the first time in recorded history, they were walking away. Dr. Sullivan supervised the final evacuation of the orbital medical station, her staff moving with practiced efficiency. Every human-designed medical scanner, every treatment protocol, every piece of equipment that required human knowledge to operate was being removed. "Doctor," called Chief Medical Officer Linda Hayes from the station's command center, "we've got incoming requests from 17 different species asking for continued medical support." Amy shook her head as she sealed the last medical container. "Tell them to contact their own medical services. Human medicine is no longer available in this sector." The removal was so thorough that monitoring stations found only empty buildings where human medical facilities had operated. Not a single piece of equipment, not one dose of medicine, not even basic medical supplies were left behind. If the galaxy wanted to reject human help, they would have to face their medical crises without any human assistance. Captain Brooks received his final orders from Admiral Cole as the human fleet prepared for departure. "All ships are to maintain complete communication silence regarding our withdrawal," she instructed. "No explanations, no justifications, no debates. We leave quietly and let our absence speak for itself." The withdrawal happened in phases that impressed even cynical council observers. First the medical teams, then the diplomatic staff, then the humanitarian aid workers, finally the military escorts. Each group took with them every piece of human technology, every research advancement, every helpful innovation they had shared over the centuries. Commander Vex Korath and General Thak Bruthorn barely noticed the human departure, too focused on their war to pay attention to what they considered a retreat by weaklings. Both sides had resumed their genocide with renewed enthusiasm, convinced that humanity's withdrawal proved their enemies' desperation. Jake walked through the empty corridors of the human diplomatic station one last time. The walls were bare, the computers wiped clean, even the furniture had been removed. 3 centuries of human presence in galactic affairs were being erased as if they had never existed. His communicator chimed with a message from the Zephyrian High Command. Ambassador Morrison, we require immediate human assistance with refugee management protocols. Jake smiled grimly and deleted the message without responding. Let them figure out refugee management on their own. Similar requests came in from the Krell War Council, demanding human medical support for their wounded warriors. Lisa Parker received the message and forwarded it to the waste disposal system. Within 72 hours, every human ship, every human diplomat, every human aid worker had vanished from the conflict zone. The evacuation was so complete that even the most advanced sensors could find no trace of human presence in the entire sector. The Zephyrians and Krell continued their war with increased fury, each side convinced that the human withdrawal was a sign of their enemy's imminent defeat. Planet-killer weapons fired freely. Civilian populations were targeted deliberately, and the genocide continued without any outside interference. On distant Earth, Admiral Cole read the final report from Ambassador Morrison. All human personnel successfully evacuated, no casualties. Complete withdrawal achieved ahead of schedule. She filed the report and opened a new directive for all Earth Command vessels. Effective immediately, no human ship or facility will respond to requests for assistance from any species currently engaged in the Zephyrian-Krell conflict or their allies. For the first time in 3 centuries, humanity had walked away from a galactic crisis. In complete silence, they had removed themselves from a situation where their help was unwanted and their compassion was mocked. The galaxy was about to discover what life looked like without humans around to clean up their messes. 6 months after the human withdrawal, Keeper Thex stood before the emergency session of the Galactic Council and tried to keep his voice steady as he read the casualty reports. The numbers were so large they seemed abstract, like calculations, rather than actual lives lost. Preliminary estimates indicate 47 billion confirmed deaths across 14 star systems, he announced to the silent chamber. An additional 23 billion individuals are classified as missing and presumed dead. The assembled representatives sat in stunned silence. Even the most callous among them struggled to process the scale of destruction. The Zephyrian-Krell War had consumed entire solar systems, reducing habitable worlds to radioactive debris fields. Ambassador Helen Torres of the Sol Diplomatic Corps sat in the observer section, taking notes on her tablet. She wore the simple blue uniform of Earth's diplomatic service, and her presence was the only sign that humanity was even aware of the emergency session. Council member Vrak of the Hegemony Coalition raised one of his tentacles. What is the status of refugee resettlement efforts? Thex's feathers drooped visibly. Critical failures across all sectors. Without human medical support, plague outbreaks have swept through refugee populations. Mortality rates and displacement. Camps have reached 60%. The crystalline representative from Altair Prime chimed with distress signals. Infrastructure collapse reports are coming in from 37 systems. Engineering failures, power grid breakdowns, transportation network disruptions. Without human engineering corps, Thex continued, most refugee facilities cannot maintain basic life support systems. We lack the technical expertise to handle displacement on this scale. Commander Sek of the Outer Rim Defense Fleet provided military updates that made the situation even worse. 17 additional species have been drawn into the conflict. The Andorian Federation and Tau Ceti Republic are actively engaged in combat operations. The Helix Consortium has declared war on both original combatants. Helen Torres listened to the reports with carefully controlled expression. Every crisis they described was something humanity had predicted and warned about. Every failure was a problem human expertise could have prevented. The worst revelation came from the medical committee. Dr. Zex, chief medical officer for the A Council, delivered his report with barely concealed panic. "Medical catastrophe is spreading faster than the war itself," he announced. "Human medical protocols were integrated into galactic healthcare systems over 3 centuries. Without human doctors, medical researchers, and pharmaceutical specialists, we cannot treat injuries from advanced weapons." Thex activated a holographic display showing medical statistics that made several representatives physically recoil. Chemical, weapon exposure, radiation poisoning, biological agent infections. Human medicine was the only effective treatment for these conditions. The economic reports were equally devastating. Trade routes that had operated smoothly for centuries had collapsed into chaos. Shipping costs had increased by 400% as pirates and raiders moved into the security vacuum left by withdrawn human patrol fleets. Human-managed trade routes carried 60% of galactic commerce, reported the Economic Committee. Without their logistical expertise and security protocols, commercial traffic has decreased by 78%. Council member Thex finally acknowledged what everyone in the chamber was thinking. The secondary effects of human withdrawal have proven more devastating than the original conflict. Helen Torres rose slowly from her observer seat. She had been silent throughout the entire session, but now 47 pairs of alien eyes focused on her with desperate hope. "Observer Torres," Thex said carefully, "does Earth Command have any statement regarding the current crisis?" Helen activated her personal recording device and spoke in the calm, professional tone that had made her famous in diplomatic circles. "The Sol Diplomatic Corps notes that this emergency session comes 6 months after humanity warned the Council about the likely consequences of the Zephyrian-Krell conflict." She displayed her own holographic data, reports that had been filed months earlier. Human analysis predicted civilian casualties in the billions, refugee displacement requiring massive humanitarian intervention, and the high probability of spreading conflict involving multiple species. The chamber remained silent as she continued. "When humanity requested additional council support for mediation efforts, we were denied. When we warned about the use of prohibited weapons, we were told to focus on trade route efficiency. When we suggested protective protocols for civilian populations, both combatant species mocked human weakness." Thex's feathers rustled nervously. "The Council acknowledges that previous decisions may have been inadequately considered. However, the current crisis requires immediate human intervention." Helen smiled politely and consulted her tablet. "I have here transcripts of official statements from both Zephyrian and Krell leadership. Commander Korath stated that humans lack the spine for real warfare. General Bruthorn suggested that stronger species should guide galactic affairs." She looked around the chamber at the assembled representatives. Both combatant species made it clear that human diplomatic methods were inadequate, and that human compassion was a sign of weakness. The hegemony representative leaned forward urgently. "Observer Torres, surely Earth Command recognizes the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding. Billions of innocent lives are at stake." "Indeed," Helen replied calmly. "That's exactly what Ambassador Morrison told this council 6 months ago. He was informed that economic considerations took priority over humanitarian concerns." She activated another display showing current human activities. "I can report that humanity is currently engaged in 14 separate peacekeeping operations in other sectors. Our medical teams are treating plague outbreaks in the Vega system. Our engineers are rebuilding infrastructure after the Centauri asteroid impact. Our diplomatic corps is mediating territorial disputes between 6 different species coalitions." The implication was clear. Humanity was not idle or indifferent to suffering. They were simply applying their resources where their help was wanted and appreciated. Keeper Thex made one final desperate attempt. The Council formally requests immediate human assistance in crisis resolution. We are prepared to offer significant compensation and expanded diplomatic privileges. Helen Torres stood and gathered her materials. I will relay the Council's request to Earth Command through proper diplomatic channels. However, I should note that humanity's current commitments may limit our availability for new assignments. She paused at the chamber door and turned back to address the Council one final time. The galaxy spent 3 centuries taking human help for granted. Perhaps this crisis will help Council members appreciate the value of what they had. The door closed behind her with a soft hiss, leaving the Council to face the burning galaxy without the one species that had always been willing to help. In the silence that followed, Thex realized that some relationships, once broken by arrogance and ingratitude, could not be easily repaired. The Council had learned too late that humanity's compassion was not weakness, but strength. And that strength, once withdrawn, left a void that no other species could fill. The galaxy was burning, and for the first time in 3 centuries, there was no one coming to put out the fires. 1 year after humanity's withdrawal, the economic collapse struck the Galactic Council like a cascade failure in a starship's reactor core. Commander Danny Price of the UES Vigilant monitored Council communications from the edge of human space, watching desperate messages pile up in their transmission buffer. The trade routes that had functioned smoothly for 3 centuries had devolved into chaos. Without human logistics coordination, shipping schedules collapsed. Without human security patrols, pirate raids increased by 600%. Without human diplomatic protocols, minor trade disputes escalated into shooting wars between merchant fleets. "Captain, we're receiving another priority transmission from the Council," reported Communications Officer Janet Mills. "Keeper Thex is requesting immediate assistance with the Outer Rim shipping crisis." Danny glanced at the message and deleted it without reading past the first line. It joined thousands of similar requests that had arrived over the past 12 months. All marked urgent, all demanding human intervention, all ignored with bureaucratic politeness. Dr. Katie Walsh, now Director of Human Medical Outreach, reviewed the latest requests for humanitarian aid in her office on Luna Station. The holographic displays showed medical crises spreading across 17 sectors, plague outbreaks that human medicine could have stopped in days, refugee populations dying from treatable diseases. "The Andorian Federation is reporting complete medical system collapse," her assistant, Dr. Mark Johnson, announced as he updated the crisis board. "They're requesting immediate deployment of human medical teams and full pharmaceutical support." Katie nodded and filed the request with the others. Standard response: refer them to their own medical services and wish them good fortune in their endeavors. The Andorians had been among the first to mock human medical ethics as weakness. When human, doctors had refused to experiment on prisoners of war. Andorian military leaders had called them soft and ineffective. Now their own medical system was crumbling, and they wanted the soft humans to save them. The refugee crisis had spiraled beyond anything in recorded galactic history. Without human engineering teams to build and maintain displacement facilities, refugee camps had become death traps. Without human logistics to coordinate food distribution, starvation was spreading faster than the war itself. Ambassador Helen Torres read the daily reports in her office at the Sol Diplomatic Corps headquarters. 23 billion refugees, scattered across 42 star systems, most lacking basic shelter or medical care. The numbers were staggering, but they represented the natural consequence of choices made by the species now suffering. The Hegemony Coalition is requesting emergency diplomatic intervention, her aide, Secretary Paul Adams, announced. 3 member species are threatening to withdraw over resource allocation disputes. Helen set down the report and looked out at Earth's blue oceans. The hegemony told us last year that human diplomatic methods were obsolete. I'm sure they'll find their own solutions. The cascade of smaller wars had surprised even human strategic analysts. The Zephyrian-Krell conflict had triggered ancient rivalries and territorial disputes across the galaxy. Species that had maintained uneasy peace for centuries suddenly found themselves in shooting wars over trade routes, colonial claims, and resource rights. Without human mediators to contain these conflicts, they spread like wildfire. The Galactic Council found itself facing 17 separate wars, with no one willing or able to serve as neutral arbitrators. Captain Price monitored tactical displays showing the expanding conflicts. The Tau Ceti Republic and Vega colonies have declared war over mining rights, he reported to Earth Command. The Helix Consortium is threatening to deploy planet-killer weapons against anyone who interferes with their territorial expansion. Admiral Patricia Cole received these reports in her office at Earth Defense Headquarters. The woman who had authorized humanity's withdrawal watched the galaxy tear itself apart with grim satisfaction. "Any requests for human peacekeeping forces?" she asked her staff. 47 formal requests this week alone, replied Colonel Steve Peterson, including offers of permanent council membership, exclusive trade agreements, and territorial concessions. Admiral Cole nodded and approved the standard response. Humanity appreciates the generous offers, but must respectfully decline due to prior commitments. The prior commitments were real. Human fleets were deployed across dozens of systems where their help was genuinely wanted and appreciated. Species that had never mocked human compassion or called human methods weak were receiving the full benefits of Earth's military and diplomatic expertise. Dr. Walsh supervised medical operations in the Proxima Centauri system, where her teams had stopped a plague outbreak that could have killed millions. The local population treated human medical staff like heroes, providing them with every resource and protection they needed. "It's amazing how much easier our job becomes when people actually want our help," she commented to Dr. Johnson as they reviewed treatment statistics. Meanwhile, in Council space, the Zephyrian-Krell War had finally ended through mutual extinction. Both species had deployed their ultimate weapons simultaneously, sterilizing each other's homeworlds and leaving behind only radioactive tomb worlds. The war that had started the crisis was over, but its consequences continued to spread. Keeper Thex sent a personal message to Ambassador Torres, marked with his highest priority codes. "The Council acknowledges that previous policies were flawed. We formally apologize for any disrespect shown to human representatives. We urgently request immediate human assistance in crisis resolution." Helen read the message 3 times before responding. "The Sol Diplomatic Corps acknowledges the Council's message. Unfortunately, humanity's current commitments prevent us from accepting new assignments at this time. We wish the Council success in resolving their difficulties." The truth was simpler and more brutal. Humanity had learned the cost of always saying yes, always helping, always being the ones to clean up everyone else's messes. They had discovered that some species would never appreciate help until it was gone. The final message came from the Galactic Council's emergency session, a formal plea signed by all remaining member species. It offered humanity virtual autonomy within Council space, permanent seats on all major committees, and exclusive rights to mediate all future conflicts. Ambassador Torres presented the offer to the Earth Assembly, where it was debated for exactly 17 minutes before being unanimously rejected. "The galaxy had 3 centuries to learn the value of human partnership," she told the assembled representatives. "Instead, they chose to treat us as disposable tools. Some lessons can only be learned through loss." Captain Price watched the last Council patrol fleet retreat from the Outer Rim sectors, abandoning even the pretense of maintaining order. Pirate fleets and raider gangs moved in immediately, carving up former Council territory like scavengers, feeding on a corpse. "The beacon network is going dark," Communications Officer Mills reported. Without human maintenance, the long-range communication system is failing sector by sector. Danny nodded grimly. The galaxy was returning to its pre-human state of isolation and conflict, each species locked in their own small corner of space, suspicious of their neighbors and incapable of large-scale cooperation. Dr. Walsh received the final medical request from Council Space, a desperate plea from survivors of the Andorian medical collapse. Half the Federation's population was dead from preventable diseases, and the remainder faced starvation as their agricultural systems failed. She filed the request with all the others and returned to her work with species that had never called. Human medicine weak or ineffective. There were always people who needed help, people who would appreciate the assistance and never take it for granted. The stars themselves seemed dimmer without human ships moving between them, carrying hope and healing to distant worlds. The galaxy had learned too late that some things, once broken by arrogance and ingratitude, could never be repaired. In complete silence, humanity had walked away from a galaxy that took them for granted. The Council had finally paid the price for treating Earth's children as disposable heroes, and the cost was higher than anyone had imagined. The last human rescue beacon went dark, and the galaxy was truly alone.